segment 5, our final segment, alas, taking science on faith. In The Devil's Delusion, you write, and I quote, "Western science is saturated by faith." What do you mean?
You run an experiment. You put your hands in your laboratory equipment. You go away for a cup of coffee. You take a nap. You come back. You expect the experiment to be continued, and that when you put your hands in the laboratory equipment, it'll be the same. Things are continuous from one moment to another. The universe doesn't shake itself in and out of existence. Things are stable. Things are predictable. Things are satisfactorily amenable to investigation. These are all items of faith. How do you know any of these? You project backwards from the modern era to say what could have happened in imperial times, Roman imperial times. How do you know the same universe was there 1,000 years ago? You're going to leave this table in about 30 seconds. How do you know a chasm isn't going to open at your feet, Peter? You don't know that. You take it on faith. And there are thousands of remarks. These are remarks within the philosophical tradition pointing out the extraordinary extent to which, in order to advance scientifically, there's an enormous body of assumptions that have to be in place, and those assumptions can't be defended. No science, Aristotle said, ever defends its own first principles, and we can't either. It's just a logical point.
All right, another quotation from The Devil's Delusion. "Members of the National Academy of Sciences are by and large persuaded that there is no God. Men and women in their millions that there is." Why should that be so?
There's a tremendous advantage in belonging to the National Academy of Sciences. And the National Academy of Sciences is an institutional source of authority and power. If these guys were going to defer to the Vatican or to a council of rabbis or to a group of Muslim clerics, much of their power and influence would be discredited. But that is to take a cynical view. The less cynical view is that a certain amount of education, a certain amount of immersion into a physical theory, and the same thing is true, immersion into a legal theory, tends to displace any other kind of ideological affiliation. And that is transmitted or transmuted into a form of denial. There is only one truth that happens to be the truth of plasma physics. That's what a plasma physicist is. And why not? 50 years studying plasma physics, that's the only truth you can see.
So you're suggesting that atheism, as it expresses itself among scientists, is a kind of déformation professionnelle?
Oh, of course. Of course. You find the same thing in people who are completely committed to wrapping Cuban cigars. That's how they think of the universe. The universe can only be illuminated in terms of a large cigar being wrapped. It's not a source of surprise.
The world of matter, again from The Devil's Delusion, revealed by the physical sciences, does not serve to endow materialism with a familiar face. There are black holes and various infernal singularities. Popping out of quantum fields, the elementary particles appear as bosons or fermions. Reality is remarkably Baroque, and it is promiscuously Catholic, small c, Catholic. So here, throughout this book, David, at one place you state it explicitly. You state, "I do not take as the burden of my argument to prove the existence of God.
Right.
I take it only to demonstrate that the scientists cannot disprove the existence of God." Fine. And but the way this book operates, that's a kind of baseline. You get that on every page. But there are other pages where if you were graphing the reader's reaction, intellectual reaction, there would be little spikes here and there in which it seems that you're saying more than that. It seems that right here, you say that science, physical science, properly understood, a true understanding of the material world around us, not only does it not mute or displace a religious sensibility, it excites a sense of wonder and mystery.
Well, I agree with that. I had no intention of concealing that. I know not seems, my lord. No, I agree completely. That is a position in the book that I do want to adopt. It certainly does, to the responsive mind, excite a sense of religious possibility. The passage about material objects that you quoted is one intended to show the vacuousness of the material as a category, even within the heart of physics. There is no sense of a material object that covers the sort of inquiry that physicists are doing. Black hole is not a physical or material object. Look, you smack your hand on the table, and then you smack your hand on the table again. How many times have you smacked your hand on the table? 2. Where is that number 2? Is that a physical object? No, of course not. And that pervades the sciences. The idea that the world of matter is the world that matters is simply not true. Or if it is true, and there's a wonderful remark by the logician Kurt Gödel in talking about materialism. Gödel was, of course, a great genius, and he had no patience for the physical sciences. And he said the only way materialism ever survives is that all of the properties that we would want from a non-material world, from a psychological or biological or religious perspective, are just slapped on top of a material object, and we describe it as material. That's no answer. I mean, even the most primitive parts of physics, force. Is force a material something? We have a very limited understanding. Even 300 years after Newton, what is force? What is force? We don't know. What is energy? Are they material? It's hard to say.
Final question, alas. Let me give you one more time. Let me give you 2 quotations and just ask you to respond. Quotation number 1 requires a little bit of a setup. The late philosopher Sidney Hook, remarkable man.
Old friend.
Oh, is that so?
Yeah.
All right, I didn't know that. I never had the chance to meet him. He died a year or 2 before I came here to the Hoover Institution. Well, but Sidney Hook was an avowed atheist, not agnostic, but atheist. And a friend of his, this was a story told to me by that friend, said to Sidney Hook, Sidney, if when you die, you discover to your surprise that there is a God after all, how will you explain yourself? And Sidney Hook replied, quote, I tell God that he had provided insufficient evidence, close quote. That's number 1. Here's number 2, Psalm 8. When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Close quote. Which quotation, which worldview, do you find, to use Richard Dawkins' phrase, more intellectually fulfilling?
Well, I've heard Sidney Hook say the same thing.
Oh, is that an old line of Sidney's?
Yeah.
All right.
What are you talking about, David? There's no God out there. No, this is just a lot of hooey. I'll have a tuna sandwich. No, there's very little substance in that quotation. And of course, there is a point of presumption in that particular argument, which Bertrand Russell also used. The point of presumption is that human beings constructed as human beings are constructed could so interact with God as to be persuaded by the countenance of the deity when they were left unpersuaded by the evidence of his handiwork. That's a remarkable presumption. Much more reasonable, it seems to me, is those who cannot see the handiwork will not be able to see the countenance either. There is a limitation, a kind of aspect blindness at work. Not everyone appreciates Mozart. It's just a fact. The second quotation, I think, is a beautiful quotation, but there's a fine line from Gerard Manley Hopkins. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod. I think that captures very elegantly the spirit of the psalm, but also something of Sidney Hook. Something of Sidney Hook. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? That's something I always ask Sidney. We did talk about that. He thought it was a New York imperative to be very tough all the time. But what he thought in his heart of hearts, that he kept to himself.
Actually, I want to ask, this is going to be the final question. So we know that this program is watched disproportionately by kids, college kids. So you have somebody in college who's going to, I don't know if you went through this when you were an undergraduate, you being you probably went through it at the age of 7. But it's the sort of thing that I went through when I was an undergraduate, which is you show up at college and you look around and you realize that a lot of very bright people are atheists. And since most people, just numerically speaking, come from these millions and millions who do believe, to assume the existence of a God, there can be a really quite disorienting moment. And given the various proclivities, the time, the course interests of the student may wish to investigate this in as rigorous a way as an 18 or 19-year-old can. What advice would you give to such a student?
To investigate the question?
Yeah.
I would suggest to any student entering college now, 2011, do what I'm sure he hasn't done. Go read the Old Testament. That should be your first challenge. I always ask my students in philosophy, have you read the Bible? Oh, yeah, I've read the Bible, sure. But when I interrogate the students, it turns out reading the Bible means they have a Bible on their bookshelf. I said, have you opened it? Yeah, we've opened it, but opening it doesn't mean reading it. The Old Testament is the greatest repository of human knowledge and wisdom in the history of civilization, any culture, any time, any place. And that really should be the first point of discussion, because every attitude current today in the discussion, from Richard Dawkins to me, to Christopher Hitchens, to lonely pastors in the Bible Belt on Sunday morning ranting from a particular text, is discussed in the Bible. And there's a character in the Bible who expresses that point of view, and there's sympathy expressed for that point of view, and there are reservations expressed by the sympathy. And it's an enormously complex, rich, dramatic piece of work. That's the first.
All right. David Berlinski, author of The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.